welcoming you to this third week of the Conscious Evolved Man, where today we are going to dive directly into two pillars, which I find are the greatest keys of personal power, freedom, and inner peace. And they are responsibility and accountability, which I find are two areas that when growing up wasn't really taught to me in a way that I could find a greater meaning within myself. Growing up, it was interesting because we were taught all the responsibilities of the law, the education, institutions, religion, but somewhere within us, I didn't feel there was a great level of opening or awareness to what it was to have self-responsibility, self-awareness. Because when you look at these two words, they really bring a great amount of integrity, a great amount of trust, not only within you, but within others, which I see build some of the greatest men when we can apply them. Because imagine when responsibility and accountability are placed together, then becomes this awareness of presence, this leadership. We can communicate our responsibility and our accountability by the actions of showing up, by being seen, and really responding to the abilities that are not only growing within us, but to all the challenges and stresses that we meet each day. That is why I find it so important not only to become aware of these, but to start looking at how we can live a life of responsibility and accountability. Because what would happen if you were to ask yourself, if I was to start to become fully conscious and responsible of my thoughts, my actions, my emotions, how would that feel? Sometimes it might be a little frightening of like, wow, I never went that deep, because I'm still understanding that my thoughts, my feelings, my emotions, they're not me. They're just, like we spoke about in the first week, like clouds passing by. They're just pieces of our consciousness, and we don't own them. What happens when we start becoming responsible of how we choose to dictate them? And even greater, looking at our accountability of when we say things, when we do things, what happens to others, especially loved ones and family, where we may not have been taught that if we act in an appropriate way, if we're irresponsible, how does it affect others? And what accountability are we being held to ourselves and others? Such important questions and areas to focus on. So today, I feel like it's a deep dive. So for those that are ready, bring out your journal, your thinking cap, and let's go on an adventure, because I feel like these two terms were areas that, like I said earlier, I struggled with, and I didn't really have a clear awareness of how to do that, because honestly, I felt like I avoided responsibility, avoided accountability. And it's only normal that if you're feeling right now, these words may feel a little yucky, or they just don't feel that friendly, because somewhere we may not be taking responsibility for where we should be, or we're not taking accountability in areas. Maybe we're even being triggered right now of like, oh wow, I may have to ask the deeper questions, the inner questions of what do I have to take responsibility in my life right now to be a better man, a conscious man? Or where do I have to take greater levels of accountability in my life so that I'm not hurting others, or I'm living in that greatest version of myself? These are all great areas to look into. But first and foremost, I'd like to just invite us just to dive into responsibility. Now, obviously, when we look at the word responsibility, if we take the words apart and we just notice there is response and ability. And what happens now when we just take the focus on the word response? Response. The conscious pause before reaction. Imagine having the ability to consciously pause, that space where choice is born, where you're responding with awareness and not reactivity. Imagine how strong and unaffected that you could move through life if you could actually have that pause. And we spoke about that in communication. We spoke about how important it is when there is a trigger, there is a reaction, there is a situation where when something happens, how important it is to pause. And now it's really taking the reins of the horse and saying, okay, now it's my responsibility to not react and just respond. Because what happens if this ability becomes the inner skill to discern and now act in alignment with your truth and value? And that you're now starting to recognize that each time a situation comes, how that responsibility becomes an automatic habit. It becomes a way where you start owning your inner world. You start crafting that ability to respond. Because the man who owns himself is unshakable, and responsibility is true ownership. It's really recognizing you are the creator, not the victim of your experience. And that's where I feel with responsibility, it's so important to choose with presence and awareness rather than from pain and chaos. Yet I know we've been there and done the opposite. We've overreacted. We've done things that we chose that we didn't want to do, and really put ourselves in a way where we've been very irresponsibility. And that's okay too. That's part of the journey of the conscious evolved man, because we have to also honor that area of our unconsciousness. For isn't true responsibility, when you really look at true responsibility, it's not about controlling everything. It's really how you respond to everything. And that's where I feel it becomes the mastery when we use responsibility to turn it inward. Because it is no one else's blame for how I think, how I feel. I have to take charge of my own experience. And that's where I find that ownership of responsibility becomes an internal journey of that awareness, so that we can communicate that through our actions and being that greater conscious evolved man. Yet, there are challenges. There are a lot of challenges with responsibility. And you know what one of my greatest challenges growing up was? Letting go of my old identity. There was a part of me that I didn't want to be responsibility. I didn't want to be responsible and hold a responsibility. I remember when I was young, I wanted to stay in a place where I could just have fun, enjoy, and just be that version of myself where I didn't have to take on too much responsibility, because somewhere I felt like it took a level of great work to be responsible. And somewhere I stood in that level of being a late bloomer, choosing to marry at a later age, and really, unfortunately, giving more energy to my irresponsibility to my responsibilities. For example, I gave more irresponsibility to the addictions, the areas of where drinking, smoking marijuana, And just allowing this feeling that I didn't have to be responsible because it was much easier to be irresponsible. Have you ever felt that, where it's like, you know what, I'm just going to be irresponsible. I'm just going to not care, not worry, because it almost felt like it was easier. And it actually took a greater level of effort to be responsible. So I chose to leave America. I chose to enter a place where irresponsibility was quite easy on every single day in Mexico. Yet I held myself in integrity. I held myself in the strength and the strongest level of work of what I did, but I never let go of the addictions. I never let go of the pornography. I never let go of the areas that were keeping me in my old identity, my old self, because it just didn't want to grow out of irresponsibility to responsibility. So then I realized it was immature, an underdeveloped area of me that I was just giving more attention to. And then I started asking myself, okay, if I'm ready to take more responsibility, what do I have to do to let go of the old identity? And that's where it took me on a great journey of honoring, respecting, and most important, forgiving those old aspects of me, and then creating a new aspect of me that I wanted to be. And so I ask you now, in being the greatest version of yourself, what responsibilities do you have to take? Whether you're a leader, a father, a brother, one that has great dreams and visions, one of the greatest questions and one of the greatest practices I'm taking right now is, what responsibilities do I need to take right now? And you know what one of the greatest responsibilities that I took forth was how to control my reaction. How to start to become so aware of the emotions and the relationship of them, the thoughts and how they were tied to the emotions, and the pain that was tied to the emotions and thoughts, so that as I respond, I'm having a greater ability to move through life in ease and grace. And so that may be one area that you can start to look at in just taking your journal out and saying, what responsibilities? And starting to even look at, how can I choose to respond versus react? Taking that sacred pause, applying the 4-technique process that we spoke about in communication. That to me really opened up the ability, because I feel like when we look at our old self, sometimes we don't want to let that go, because we're afraid if we let go of that, who are we going to be? We let go of the old college days, we let go of the old party days, we let go of all those areas that we thought who we were. That doesn't mean we don't forget about the achievements, we don't forget about all the great things. We can reflect upon that. Yet when we look at a tree, as it lets go of its old leaves, it opens up to its new blossoms each year to expand and grow, because those are the conscious laws of the universe. So letting go of the old identity was one challenge. And really asking yourself, what responsibilities can I now take in to be the new identity, the greater version of myself? The second challenge that I find that I was really having a difficult time with and growing up in life was seeing that responsibility was a burden. Actually, it felt like a greater level of work. And I noticed this when I was in my childhood. And I don't know if you ever remember this when you were young, and it was the weekend. And I remember I was off school. I was ready to go out and play with my friends. And I was just so happy to be out in the sun and enjoy playing sports or going for a good hike and just feeling like I'm free of this school, of this responsibility, of this work. I'm ready just to be. Yet what would happen? Parents would say, it's time to clean your room. Could you do your chores today? I need help. These are your responsibilities. And immediately I was like, no, this is my weekend. I want to play. I want to have fun. I've just been responsible for 5 days. I just want to take that, shut that all in a drawer, and now just have fun because I associate responsibility with work. I associate responsibility with this level that it was negative. It's like it became a job. It's like I don't have the time. It's too much to handle. Like, I really don't want to do this anymore. And yet, I associate it with a negativity. And so every time I grow up and people are like, well, aren't you going to be more responsible? I started to feel like, well, that sounds like a negative connotation, because growing up, I feel like that responsible was always like, well, you're still young, you got to grow up and be more responsible. Okay, well, the passive aggressive or patronizing. Well, if you did this, you'd be more responsible. If you were driving less fast, you'd be more responsible. Because I know when I was a teenager, if we want to talk about irresponsibility, I stacked 6 points in Maryland, which basically meant I could not find any insurance between 16 and 18 because I was being technically irresponsible and driving fast, especially to school, especially with my friends, because irresponsible felt fun. It felt exciting. It felt like breaking the law. It felt like, oh, I could be someone different. And so all of a sudden I was valuing irresponsibility more than responsible, because somewhere I thought responsibility was too boring. It was just dull. It was an area that, like, I'm greater than that. Yet I knew that was an immaturity, an underdeveloped area. So they may be themes that you can look at within yourself just to say, where are the areas in my life that I've been irresponsible? And how am I still acting from them? Make a list of them. And then on the other side of the list, what areas would I like to become more responsible from that irresponsibility? That could be another aspect and a solution for you to start shifting from those old beliefs. Because what happens if responsibility just became a limited belief? And that now you shift that limited belief of responsibility into a new empowered belief by looking at responsibility is actually the gateway to your purpose. Responsibility is actually the foundation to my strength. What happens if responsibility is the building blocks to the greatest, most incredible future I could dream of? And now it starts taking that shift, or responsibility was no longer this negative entity. It now becomes more of a positive area. And so those challenges, I felt, kept me from not valuing responsibility, valuing how I could rise in becoming a greater conscious man. And I know those that are going through difficult times, those going through challenging times, it may not always be easy, because there is a lot of resistance to responsibility. There's a lot of resistance to these old programs, these old beliefs, and sometimes we're just like, F responsibility. I don't want to be responsible. I want to allow myself to stay in victimhood. I want to allow myself to live in pain. I want to stay in being an autopilot and just doing the same thing every day, because it's that much easier to drink my beers and smoke and do pornography. That feels better. But what happens if that's just a limitation too? And that when you break out of that and you look at the ability to rise, then there becomes a whole new ballgame. And that's where I feel one of the greatest levels is seeing how we can shift that avoidance of responsibility. Because I'll tell you one thing, once you start taking responsibility and seeing the things that you don't want to see. I'm going to say that again. When you take responsibility and seeing the things you don't want to see, it's like shining a light into an area of darkness or your shadow, which can be extremely scary, extremely challenging and hard. Yet when you shine a light in a room and you brighten it, it becomes actually more safe because now you're aware of the pieces that have been hiding. And once you start becoming aware of that resistance, that avoidance, that chaos, those challenges, then bit by bit, you're able to transform them. Because the greater level of awareness, the greater levels that you're able to bring light to those situations. For example, when I was smoking marijuana, I used it as a gateway to connect higher and higher to the divine. Yet I knew that it wasn't responsible. I knew that it affected me in ways because in one moment I'd be very connected up to the divine, but then as it wore off, I felt this feeling of malaise, tiredness, exhaustion, and then I saw how it affected my relationships. And so once I started to bring a greater light to it of like, okay, this piece is not allowing me to be more responsible in my actions day to day, bit by bit, I started to build up the strength of just becoming aware of it, communicating through my actions that I am a greater version of this plant, which is a beautiful plant, an herbal medicine, but without it, I can still connect higher through meditation. I can go to the gym and develop greater levels of strength within my physical, which held my strength in my mental, which allowed my emotions to be happier. And that started to just shift that addiction of marijuana. And then I started to realize that resistance of not being responsible, that irresponsibility started to fall and fade away because I was just shining more light on those areas that didn't want to be seen. I was creating a greater level of responsibility for those unhealed areas, because what happens if that marijuana was just a way to numb myself from not wanting to feel the unhealed aspects of my body, numb myself from the conflicts of the external environment, numb myself from unhappiness. Yet once I started to become more responsible in how I can make myself feel good by doing the natural things around me, it started to shift that. So those are the areas that I feel that were very impactful for me. What are your areas? What are the areas that you feel you have the most difficult time in taking responsibility? And write them down, because every challenge you write down actually becomes a great opportunity for you then to draw greater awareness and communicate that down by writing it down and then journaling. And you'll start to see the solutions are automatically going to come forward. You know, one powerful thought. You're not responsible for your first thought, but you're responsible for your second thought. Just like you're not responsible in maybe what comes up that you're not aware of. But once you become aware of that, then you're responsible for taking that lead, taking that next step. And that's what I felt has really helped me in the consciousness that's evolved me to be a greater man, because I had to be responsible to start looking at those areas, those fears, those challenges, those difficulties. And I promise you, the more you start looking at them and honoring them and respecting them, it becomes easier where they don't have a hold over you anymore, and you actually rise higher because you're taking control. You're seeing that by being responsible for each and everything you do in your life, those areas don't pull you down because you're above them and not below them. And that's where I feel right now, it just becomes the personal awareness of how we meet that ability to respond. With hand in hand in responsibility, then comes accountability. And I tell you, if I thought responsibility in my life was challenging, accountability was unseen, unheard of, and probably one of the areas I want to avoid with all cost. But before we jump into those wonderful challenges, let's just talk about what accountability is. The conscious art of being answerable to your words, to your actions, and to your impact. seen or unseen. If responsibility is the internal ownership of your inner world, accountability is the external alignment of your outer world, meaning it's recognizing how your actions impact others and your alignment of what you do and how they affect everything outside of you, also within you. You know, I went to a deep dive and I was looking at impersonal conflicts, especially with myself and wife, and I'm like, wow, responsibility and accountability sometimes get linked together. Sometimes, well, you're responsible, you're accountable, and both words almost seem like there was this unshakable blame. It was like, I couldn't quite understand them because I felt like responsibility was one arrow, accountability was another arrow, and I was just pinned against the board because I was like, wow, I can't take this anymore. So I started to just dive deeper and say, what happens if responsibility is the cause and accountability is the reaction? Think about that. If responsibility is your ownership, that preventive ability, that responsible nature of your words, your thoughts, your actions, the cause. And the accountability is the action, the impact, what's happened after you've spoken those words, and how we're gonna regulate ourselves, track what is being done to us. Because, you know, at the end of the day, what I've recognized with accountability is it's a personal choice. No one can make you accountability. No one can make you accountable. It's only your choice to make yourself accountable. It's that element that, yes, many people can say you're accountable, I'm going to hold you accountable, but really it becomes your own inner journey of owning your role in every situation. And most important, standing in integrity with your truth. Because accountability really becomes one of the greatest practices when you start noticing what happens when I react, what I do, when I do it, and why I do it. And a lot of times, we have to step back and realize it's not us, even though it is, but they're the old programs, the old conditions, and a lot of times what we've learned from our parents. Not to blame them or shame them too, but what we're actually transforming and becoming even greater in consciousness so that we can evolve through that and then help others become aware of that. You know, I looked at accountability as punishment. I remember my wife many times saying, I'm going to hold you accountable, and it felt like I'm being held as a punishment. I'm going to hold you accountable for this. I was like being held in this discipline. Even when I was growing up, I remember my parents saying, I'm going to hold you accountable for this and that, and it almost felt like a death sentence. Like I was being sent to my room and like, well, you did this, so I'm going to hold you accountable. And so the word accountability was placed right next to responsibility as a negative level. Yet I knew somewhere as I started to grow up, it's time to start looking at accountability, because if I'm not taking myself accountable, I'm avoiding consequences. Accountability is not a punishment. It really is a pathway to freedom, to embody leadership, and most important, self-respect. And what I've learned, you know, the first step to change is being accountable for your life. And that's what really helps you move into the direction of becoming the evolved conscious man. Using these two pillars in your day-to-day activities. Because once again, you can ask yourself, where in my life have I not held myself accountable? They're big ones that sometimes we don't want to see because we don't want to feel those negative energies. And they become challenges. But yet what I'm aware of is accountability becomes a commitment. It becomes a commitment to integrity because you do what you say. And you do it with consistency. And you show up. And when you start showing up with accountability, people start to look at you in a whole new way. When you bring forth your accountability in vulnerable natures, you connect deeper. And the greater you become accountable, the greater you become responsible. They become a team together and forming such a tight element of integrity, which is really missing in our society. When we come together and we show how responsible and accountable we are, that is some of the greatest transparency and authenticity that allows people to be inspired and allow them to look up to you because you're showing what many people have not shown. Because many people do not want to be accountable. They don't want their problems, their past, their experience to be shown because somewhere that will show a negative side where they don't want to see. And somewhere in our society, we can only show the good side. Because if we show anything negative side, we're deemed as bad people. So going into the challenges of accountability, why do you think there is this avoidance? Well, for me, there was this avoidance of consequence. Because if I know I did something wrong and it was shown, then I knew that I was going to be punished, as I said before. But most important, I knew I was going to be judged. And isn't it interesting, as men, we don't want to be judged. We don't want to be rejected. We don't want to be abandoned. Yet if I would be accountable for something that wasn't so pleasant, for example, when we were young and we were stupid and silly, we would take toilet paper and throw them around the trees of our neighbors. We would do silly things by maybe throwing rocks at mailboxes. We would go in and just do ignorant things, not to hurt anyone, but just to pretend that we were adults, pretend that we were responsible because we were older than who we were, but irresponsible really. And I remember anytime that we were caught, anytime that we were lectured by parents, anytime that we were sat down, the accountability felt more like guilt and felt like shame. And on the scale of the lowest vibration to the highest vibration, shame is actually the lowest one. And I felt many times when I was being held accountable for the areas, whether it was in my relationships, that this shame came up. Even now with my relationship with my wife, she is such a stickler for accountability. And one of the greatest challenges I have is when we are in a fight and I say something stupid, or I'm coming from tiredness, or I haven't eaten, or I'm just exhausted, and she's asking me, and I just come out and project anger. All of a sudden, it creates a trigger with her, and she gets upset. Yet immediately afterwards, she wants me to be accountable for what I did. And I'm upset at her for her getting upset at me, and we're in a double trigger, and before we know it, it's becoming like this huge fight that just started from one word to another word. Really, another world. Another word to another word. And if you've ever been in that, where you're linked in fights and the next one wants to hold you accountable, and you're still caught in that charge, it just feels impossible because there's all this heavy emotion. There's all this pain. There's all this blame, shame, guilt. And so somewhere, when being held accountable, held in a court of law to my wife, it felt impossible because all of a sudden I had to ignore everything else from what I supposedly did, in the sense of not so much ignore what I did, but ignore her reactions of what happened. Actually, I was ignoring everything I did, so it came out the way it was supposed to. It just became this fight and challenge where accountability was now being used against me. And that was the point where I felt like I was avoiding it. I was being challenged by it. And it just became this area of punishment. So that might be one area in your life where when accountability has been held, it's been used against you. But what happens if we frame accountability as empowerment? What happens if we start looking at the areas that we've incorrectly, from under in development, immaturity, and now we start shifting to how we can welcome feedback, welcome correction? Because what happens is the more we start to feel what we did that impacted others, it helps us evolve through empathy. It helps us evolve through compassion. And our accountability even becomes greater because then with everything that we do, we're now drawing greater lens of awareness of how it affects others, even our internal journey. Another challenge that I had with accountability was this fear of appearing weak. Because again, growing up, we had to be strong, we had to be tough, we couldn't show any sign of weakness, because if you showed any sign of weakness, you weren't a man. If you showed any vulnerability, you were looked at as being sensitive. Yet we all know our old programs, old areas that are of that toxic masculinity, or what I like to call it, underdeveloped masculinity. And so growing up, I felt when I did something wrong, maybe if I didn't take my dog out and he peed in the house, or I didn't do my homework and the teacher, was asking why I didn't do my homework, or I just didn't do something that I was responsible for, I had an excuse. I had some type of deflection. I had something that I just couldn't speak my truth because there was this fear of emitting fault. I was afraid of being weak because if I showed fault, then somewhere I wouldn't be accepted. Somewhere I would be judged again. Somewhere I would be rejected. So one of the things about accountability is to really start looking at the lists of fears. Because if you look deeper into it, what happens when you look at the fear of failure with accountability? Because if I share something that I'm accountable for and it didn't go right in business, didn't go right with my employees, didn't go right with individuals, then how am I supposed to then not feel the fear of failure? Because I feel failure with most men. Once we feel it, we don't want to say anything about it. We don't want to be held accountable. So sometimes it's stepping back and saying, what other fears? The greatest fear, which I'm overcoming now through sometimes my thoughts or my going to left field, as you see, pulling you back now into the center diamond, speaking my thoughts, staying on track, not trying to get too far out, but coming right back in. As you see with myself and my teaching, sometimes I'll go far around and come back to the point. So thank you for staying focused, as I am too. Is that fear of being seen. Because somewhere, if I'm being held accountable, I also have to see the areas that may have failed, that may have appeared weak, and most important, the areas that I've impacted others. And one of the greatest fears that I had growing up was I never wanted to hurt people. I never wanted to do things wrong against people. And so when my actions did hurt them, I would want to avoid that as quick as possible because I didn't want to see or accept my own actions. I didn't want to accept what was being done underneath because I was avoiding that. And so the reason I share how important accountability is because when we start to understand that there becomes this inner liberation, when we stop blaming, when we stop avoiding, when we stop hiding, and we just become as transparent as possible, then becomes this inner truth that starts to rise. And I feel in this stage, and you look right now within our politics, our government, our religion, our institutions, very few organizations are held accountable. Very few. It's by law, it's by dictation, but it's not through transparency. And if you notice, when things aren't transparent, it may create conflict because all of a sudden there's things that are not being seen. And what's underneath that may not be so responsible in their actions. And so as we start to embody accountability, embody responsibility, then we start to help everyone around us. But most important, we help ourselves. Because what I've learned that's so important is the more responsible I am to myself, the more responsible I am to others. The more accountable I am to myself, the more accountable I am to others. So now what happens if it becomes your journey to really apply these in each step? Because, when I follow my word, when I keep my word, then things consistently get done. When I do what I say I will do, even when no one is watching, then there becomes this greater level of strength within me, this greater integrity that I can do it without seeking acceptance on the outside. These are the areas that I find responsibility and accountability are so important in our life, especially at this moment now, because very few are practicing it in its fullest nature. When I say very few, the greater, older programs. There are those that have great consciousness. There are those that practice accountability and responsibility. They are out there. Yet the masses may not be held in their highest consciousness because self-accountability and self-responsibility aren't really huge teaching blocks that we see. And that's why I'm so excited to bring this forth and allow you and each one that's watching this to dive deeper into this. And so as we come into closure, as we come into what it is, I have some beautiful questions for you to write down. Some beautiful questions that may be a great assignment for you to journal. Great work to continue this is, where in my life am I avoiding responsibility? And what is it costing me emotionally, spiritually, relationally, and financially? What beliefs do I carry about responsibility that are empowering or limiting? How would my life change if I fully stepped into radical responsibility? So those are the three questions I have for responsibility. Regarding accountability, who in my life holds me accountable lovingly without enabling me? How can I create systems of accountability that supports my evolution, not shame of me? How can I consistently follow through my word when no one is watching? Those are powerful questions to ask. Very powerful. Because the more we can dive inward and really see in our lives where responsibility and accountability are showing up, then we start to take those steps forward in becoming a greater conscious evolved man. And sometimes these haven't been spoken about to us. Sometimes they're not brought forward because our parents never had that, and that's okay. Sometimes we don't feel comfortable, and that's okay. Keep going through that old belief that it's not okay to feel not okay. It's okay if we felt irresponsible. It's okay if we didn't feel accountability was in our life. It's okay. And we keep rising forward. We keep moving into greater levels of expansion, because when accountability and responsibility are brought within us, then we start to unravel all those areas of resistance, avoidance, and challenges within us. That's why I wanted to share these, but also give you the personal keys to move through them. And I really feel through these keys, you're seeing each week we're building off of those. Those keys are becoming greater aware of your emotions, thoughts, and feelings. Creating personal ownership of your actions. Writing down when times of challenges come and to see what's underneath each of those thoughts, emotions. And really starting to see what is it within me that I want to be more responsible and more accountable. The last two things I'm going to leave you with are some deep dives, some very deep questions for you. And that is, where in my life am I taking full responsibility but avoiding accountability? Where in my life am I performing accountability but not taking responsibility? Again, remind yourself the difference, tongue-tied, of responsibility and accountability. The cause, the action, the area of response, the area of being answerable to. So when you clearly understand the definition of both, then look at this question deeply, these questions, because it starts to then open up a greater aspect of you. What I found for myself is when I am in greater accountability and responsibility with myself, there's a greater version that wants to rise. And I'm just so excited now to see that great version, see that great leader, see that great healer, see that great husband, see that great brother, see that great man that is here to help others. Just as I see in you, all those aspects that you want to see, that magnificent, incredible, phenomenal being that is you already. And as you see it, what responsibilities are you taking to close the gap and allowing yourself to be it? Because sometimes there is a gap, there's a space that we're still evolving in being the greatest version of who we are. And right now we are the greatest version. Right now we are. Even since we were born, we are the greatest version. Yet we constantly evolve to higher and higher levels every day, as you see in nature. So as we keep evolving, that takes greater levels of responsibility, greater levels of accountability, especially for those that want to lead, those that are here to help others, those that know that you have a mission on this earth, those that know that you're here with purpose. Because when you know you're here with purpose, and you know you are here to bring great change, then you know you're here to bring forth your greatest responsibility and accountability for each and everything that you do. So once again, thank you all for this wonderful opportunity to explore responsibility and accountability. And For those that, of course, are going through challenging times, that need additional help, whether through healing, coaching, or self-developmental programs, I'm here. I'm here to help serve, I'm here to help assist, but I'm also here to remind you that everything you have is within you. And it just becomes a matter of understanding that responsibility within yourself, of meeting it. And then once you meet it, owning it. So as you own it, you're accountable for every great thing you do, every amazing thing you do, every aspect that people see you as I see you, as that conscious, evolved man. Because that's what you are. And that's what I'm here to remind you through these powerful weeks. So once again, thank you for this powerful journey as we go deeper and deeper each week. These 12 weeks of the conscious evolved man that's going to open, awaken, and bring forth those great tools, innate spiritual gifts that are here for you to be that great man that you are. So wishing you all a most beautiful, blessed day. And once again, thank you for allowing yourself to remember all of this that's coming before you.